Hello and welcome, this is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share some quick card backgrounds using this Peony Celebration Press Plate. Now, this must have been popular because I have had this on order with my local store since it came out, and I'm so excited that I finally received it. I'm going to use 3 different techniques to create backgrounds for cards, and because this is a large floral background, it's going to create the entire background, so really all it needs is a sentiment. Now, unlike other backgrounds, this one's a little bit different. This one, when you press it, you get the imprint of the background and then the details of the flowers. So it creates a fun, unique look, and you can use it in a few different ways from other backgrounds. For my first background, I'm using Spellbinders watercolor cardstock, and I'm using some Versamark ink. So I've taped my cardstock on the clear plate of my Better Press. I use the Versamark ink on the press plate and then put the top onto the base and run it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine to really press that ink in there. And not only do you get that ink pressed in there, but you also get that image pressed in there, and it's a gorgeous image. Once I have that ink on there, I'm trying to touch it as little as possible. I know I'm going to cut about 1/8 of an inch around the outsides, but I don't want to affect my print at all. So I'm trying to be careful to only touch the outsides where I'll be cutting off anyways. I'm using some black embossing powder, and then I'm going to use my heat tool to melt that powder right on the background. Now, the easiest way to do this is hold one corner and then use the heat tool and move it around. Also, best to heat up your embossing tool before you start embossing, just to eliminate some of the warping. It also embosses a lot faster when you do that. So I'm going to do about 3/4 of this background, and then I'm going to set it down, move my finger to the opposite side, and then do that background, or the part of the background that I'm holding. And you can see how this creates immediately a really interesting looking background. And you could even leave it all on its own like this. To make sure the entire thing is embossed, I like to tilt it in the light because you can see a visual difference between the background part that is embossed as well as what is not embossed. And you definitely want to make sure it's completely embossed before continuing. For this background, I'm doing some watercolor, and because that entire background is embossed, it's going to resist the watercolor, which makes it so much easier to color this. I'm using Distress refills here. They are a dye-based ink. They work perfect for watercoloring as well as refilling those ink pads. And for the leaves, I'm using bundled sage and peeled paint. So I start doing the leaves with bundled sage, starting where I want the ink to be colored the darkest, and very quickly do the entire leaf. And I'm doing it very messily because anything that is on the black embossed part, totally going to resist it. It's going to like push the ink almost back into the open areas. And you're also not going to see if there's any ink on top of there, you're not going to see it anyways. So you don't have to be super careful. Then I'm taking the peeled paint ink and just dotting it where I want it to be darkest. I'll wipe off my brush onto my paper towel and then just blend it out a tiny little bit. That ink will start to blend on its own, but it doesn't totally blend completely on its own, so it does need a little bit of help. And I like to take the excess of the ink off before I blend it. Otherwise, I'm just going to make that entire leaf peeled paint, and I don't want that. For backgrounds like this, I like to start with the greenery first. It just gives me a little bit of a clearer idea where each and every single one of those flowers are, so I can see those flowers a little bit better. And I do realize as I'm watercoloring my flowers later that I missed a few leaves, and I will be doing them as I work. But this is a super easy background because I'm only using 2 colors for each of the leaves and then 2 colors for each of the flowers. I'm going to keep them in the pinks and coral tones for the flowers, but you can do whatever colors you want. You can do them all different colors if you want. Once my leaves are done, I can start working on my flowers right away. Because everything is embossed, it kind of creates a little bit of a ridge between the areas, so I don't really have to worry about much ink running. There is a point where I do get a tiny little bit of green seeping into one of the petals. All I do is take that paper towel, blot it where that is, and it stops that, and then I can color over it with the color that I want it to be. For the base of every single flower, I'm using spun sugar. It's a very nice, super light colored pink. And then I'm taking a darker pink or coral color and dotting it where I want the color to be darker and shaded. and then wiping my brush off and then using it to blend that color out. Exactly the same way that I did the leaves, I'm just using floral colors. So for some of the flowers, I used worn lipstick. For some of the flowers, I used abandoned coral, which is very close to worn lipstick, but a little bit brighter. And to be honest, in the end, you don't really see, there's actually one flower that's done with the worn lipstick, and that's the first one. But by the time I'm done, you don't really see the difference between the abandoned coral and the worn lipstick. So I would just eliminate the worn lipstick and just use abandoned coral, because if you want that color to be a little bit lighter, you can dip the brush in it, dot the excess off, and then do it just to get a tiny bit lighter. And then for some color or some flowers, so that they're not all exactly the same, I'm using picked raspberry as the darker color. It is one of my favorites of the Distress ink. I just love that bright pink tone, and it works perfectly with the spun sugar as well. So that spun sugar can go either just pink or towards a corally tone. So again, I start with the spun sugar, do the entire flower, and you can see I'm doing it very, very quickly. I'm not being careful at all. I don't even have to worry about going outside the lines, because outside the lines is that black background. And that was the moment when I just blotted off some of the green from the leaves that was seeping in. And then I can continue. So for this background, one of the reasons it is a very quick background to do is A, you don't need to wait for anything to dry between the leaves and the florals. And then for coloring the florals, you're just doing a wash of that light color over the entire thing, dotting in the next color, and then blotting off the excess off your brush, and then bleeding or blending it out just a tiny little bit. You could, if you wanted, once it was completely dry, repeat the same process for the florals just to get that color a little bit deeper and darker. Personally, I didn't find it necessary because that background is so busy anyways. I don't think you miss if it isn't the most deepest or the darkest color on the center. I like it the way it was. But if it's something that you want more detail in each and every flower, you absolutely could. You could even take some pencil crayons and go in and just color in some extra detail as well. One of the reasons why I like watercoloring with these distressed refills is because they are a dye-based ink. They're transparent, they blend beautifully with each other, and I can get from the darkest, deepest color of each one to the lightest tone, just depending on how much water I've used. Now, watercolor is one of my favorite ways to do a background, and especially with something like this, because there's so much embossing on that background, I don't have to be neat and tidy. I don't have to worry about staying within the lines. So it gives me a little bit more freedom to just enjoy the process. And watercoloring is one of those ways that I do really enjoy the process. So for my leaves, I'm just putting the darkest color towards the base. In the center of these flowers, it's kind of a little bit more dense, and the petals are really, really tiny. So I'm just kind of dotting the darker color on the base of most of those pieces, but because they are so tiny, it doesn't need to be perfect. When you look at this background, you're looking at the whole thing, the background as a whole. You're not looking at individual flowers and whether each and every part is shaded perfectly, because there's so much detail in that background and there's so much to look at. So I just dot it at the base of most of those florals. And sometimes if there's two floral or petal bases beside each other, I'll just dot it kind of between them, and it works. So I kept my colors coral and pink, but again, you can do them whatever colors you want. The pink is more my go-to and my favorite when it comes to florals. I added the coral in there just for a little bit of variation, because I wanted the flowers to be similar but not all exactly the same color. Just a personal preference once again. Because this is a press plate, there are so many different ways that you can use this press plate. I'm just doing 3 techniques here, but there's many other ways that you can color them. You could color them with your favorite dye markers if you want. Here with the watercolor, if you wanted to watercolor, you could do it with the dye base markers as well. You could scribble some onto your work surface, depending on what your work surface is, or onto like a plastic lid. You could recycle that, scribble your dye base marker on there and use that for watercoloring. The only thing is, when you're using a dye-based marker, your colors are going to be significantly lighter than the marker color itself, because when you're picking up that marker color, you're picking up a lot of, or you're putting a lot of water with it. So your colors are going to be very pale. So just keep that in mind. If you want your colors to be quite vibrant, you may have to do a couple coats. That's one of the reasons why I love using the re-inkers, because I can get some vibrant backgrounds and just have to do one layer. Once my background is completely finished here, I can let that totally dry. My piece of cardstock here is 5.5 inches by 4.25. So I'm going to cut 1/8 of an inch off of each side to make it sized for my A2 card front with a little bit of a border around it. But it must be completely dry before you start to cut it, because you're going to ruin your watercolors if you wait till it, or if you don't wait till it's totally dry. So my background here, I've left it for a while. I want to say it was about an hour that I left it to dry, and most of it's dry, but there was a couple areas that were slightly damp. The easiest way to check is to put a clean piece of paper towel over top of it, and that way you can not only blot any areas that might be a little bit wet, but if there happen to be any of that color on top of the embossing, you're not going to be able to see it, but by using that paper towel on it, you'll blot it and bring up that color, so you'll completely dry it. I'm just using a plain white card base for this card. I've cut it down with that Spellbinders guillotine trimmer. I'm using that so much. It's such a handy size for card making. I'm using Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle to glue my pieces together, and using an acrylic block on top of that to hold everything down nice and flat. Off screen, I die cut a thanks sentiment, and this one is from the Yana's Layered Script sentiment set. It's one that I use often because I just love that scripty font. So here we have our first card, and again, that background was so simple to do, but it creates a really beautiful, vibrant look. For the second card, I'm using Better Press cardstock, and I'm using some die tape to tape that card base, or that piece of Better Press cardstock, to my plate. I want to make sure when I've done inking this and I flipped my cardstock over that it's not going to move on me. So I inked it with some archival ink. This is the same or very similar to the Better Press ink, but it's just in a bigger pad. And I'm using the stacking on my Spellbinders Platinum 6 for embossing a die. But instead of embossing a die, we're going to be embossing that Better Press plate. So because we've inked it with that archival ink, not only are we embossing it, but we're also imprinting that ink on the background. So we're going to get a background that's nice and black, but we're also going to emboss all of that detail from the plate on there. So you're going to get lots of textured dimension from that. Because that archival ink is permanent, when I go to do some ink blending on top of it, it's not going to move, and I'm not going to be able to see any of these ink colors if I happen to go outside the edges. If you were to use a lighter colored ink for that background, you'd have to be a little bit more careful when you're coloring your background in this way. So I'm just using regular ink blending brushes for the lightest color, and then I'm going in with a detailed ink blending brush, and I'm using that to get some of the detail that's a little bit closer to my florals. Just like the other background, I'm starting with my leaves, and then I'm going to do my flowers. A little bit easier to do the leaves on this one because I've already done it on the first one, so I remember exactly where all of those leaves are. And I'm using peeled paint to do the shaded detail. So the colors that I'm using for this background are exactly the same as my first background, but this time I'm using ink pad form. That last time I was using the re-inker form. And if you don't happen to have re-inkers for your dye-based ink pads, you could also take your ink pad and smush it onto your work surface if it's non-porous, and then use your water brush to pick up the ink that way. So if you wanted to do watercolor with dye-based inks and you don't happen to have re-inkers, that's another way that you can do it. So my leaves are done, and I'm going to do the same thing with my florals. I'm starting with that spun sugar distress pad, and then I'm going to go in with a detailed ink blending brush and do some of that detail with the abandoned coral and picked raspberry. Because I couldn't really tell the difference between the abandoned coral and the worn lipstick for my first background, I just eliminated it with this one. I'm going to create a very similar looking background with these colors and this technique as my first background, but it's really a personal preference. This is for people that don't necessarily love doing watercolor, because it's not everyone's cup of tea. It's something that I love doing, but I know that not everyone does. So here is a way to get a very similar look. It's also very easy to do, but you're not using that watercolor. The other difference is because my first background, the background was embossed, it has a bit of a glossy texture to it. because this one is just using that archival ink. It has more of a matte texture to it, so you don't have the contrast in textures with the florals, but you do get the embossed texture from embossing that plate. Once again, this technique works best if your background is really dark so that you don't see any of the ink if you happen to ink blend onto that background. And most of the ink blending on that background would be the lighter color tones of these ink pads, so it would be the bundled sage and the spun sugar. So even though I used black for doing my background here, you could use a dark navy or a dark forest green or something like that, and that would work as well. Because that color is darker than the colors that we're using, you could get a very similar look, but with a background that's not necessarily black. So if black is not your cup of tea, you could also do that. I really enjoy black with bright colors, so I did my background, both of my backgrounds with black. The last technique as well, because it's embossed, you could use, say, a silver or a gold embossing powder. You would get a very similar look. And because that embossing resists your inks as you're watercoloring, you're not going to have any of that ink staying on that embossing. It wouldn't dry on there. So when at the end you go to blot it up, you would be picking up any of that ink that happened to be on that embossing. So if you don't necessarily like backgrounds that are dark like this, you could also use the last technique, but with a lighter colored embossing, just to get a different look, but also have the resist for your background. So it's really a matter of personal preference, what techniques you prefer, which ways you prefer to go, and what look you like. I, again, love the look of a dark background with the bright florals, but I know it's not everyone's cup of tea. So once I am done this background, just like my last one, this background is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So I'm going to use my trimmer to cut it down to 4 inches by 5 1/2 inches. Now I could just take 1/4 inch off of 2 of the sides. I prefer to do 1/8 of an inch off of each one of the sides to create that size. That way, when I did my embossing, if by chance the paper warped in any way, shape, or form, I'm straightening it out as I'm trimming it. I don't really find that it warps with this technique, but it's an option if you find that your paper is warping. Just take a little bit off of each side. So I just showed you this background with the other card side by side, and you can see how at first glance they look very, very similar. It's not until you turn them into the light that you see the different texture on the back and that you'll notice the embossed texture on this one. So once again, personal preference, whatever you prefer. And these techniques aren't just for this plate. You could use these techniques for other plates as well. For my sentiment for this card, I used the Wonderful Script Sentiment set, and I chose the Hello sentiment for that one. I'm using the Treasured cardstock. This one is in silver, and I chose the glitter cardstock, and this is going to give it just a little bit of different texture because I don't have that shine for my background like I had for the first card. I thought that glitter cardstock would be perfect for that sentiment, and it coordinates beautifully. The other thing is that cardstock, that Treasured cardstock, they've come in gold, silver, and rose gold. They die cut beautifully. I've die cut many of them, and I've used very intricate dies for them. They die cut beautifully. For my last card, I'm using my Glimmer system, and I'm using espresso bean Glimmer foil to foil that background. Once again, I like the dark backgrounds with this, and this is going to work best with the technique that I'm using for this one. After that background is done, I'm using my solid hot foil plate and using up that foil waste. I'm not going to use this background with this card, but I will save it for a future card. It's just much easier to use up this foil waste with a solid piece of cardstock or with the solid hot foil plate and store that rather than trying to store the excess foil. I'm doing this on Hammermill cardstock. It's my favorite for doing that foiling. On this background, you probably can't see it on camera, but some of that detail was a little bit fuzzy. I had a little bit of overfoiling. So I'm using a piece of dye tape and I'm just pressing it on there to lift up that excess foil. Now this particular dye tape works perfect for taping down dyes, but it's not super sticky. So I took a piece of tape, put it on my t-shirt to take off a little bit of that extra stick, and then I'm doing this. So you don't want to do this with a piece of tape that's very, very sticky, because it's just going to stick to your paper and then you're going to rip it. So definitely test on a scrap before you put this onto your piece, just to make sure that you're not going to attach it to that paper and completely rip it. I've done it recently with a tape, not the dye tape that I used today. So learn from me and just test your tape on a scrap first. So for this background, I'm coloring it with Copic markers. I prefer to color with Copic markers simply because I like the blend best. You could use dye-based markers here if that's what you prefer. For me, it just starts peeling far too fast, so I don't like it. I'm using 2 colors for the green and 2 colors for the light peachy color. I wanted to keep these florals as light and delicate as possible. And I'm also doing some super quick coloring. That's why I'm only using 2 colors with each one. For my leaves, I'm using YG00 and YG03, and I'm using the darker color towards the base of the leaf and the lighter color towards the outside. I'm not worrying about getting the entire leaf colored. So several of them have fairly white edges, and I'm totally fine with that. And that's more the look that I was going for. I just wanted a hint of color on the leaves. For the leaves themselves, it didn't really matter whether I did the lighter color first and then the dark color, or the darker color first and then the lighter color. And I'm just starting at the base of them and kind of flicking the color out. I'm using the same color or the same technique for my florals, just on a little bit larger scale because the florals are larger. I'm using ROO and RO2. And for these ones, I did find that it worked better for blending if I did the darker colored first and then the lighter color. I found with this floral, I started with the lighter color and then did the darker color, but I could see the edges of the darker color a little bit more. It doesn't show up as much in the video, and I wanted it to kind of blend out to that white. Again, with these florals, most of the edges of the petals are white, which is the look that I was going for. I just wanted, again, like just a hint of color, just a kiss of color. I didn't want these florals to be super bright. I was going for a bit of a different look from my first 2 cards. So after doing a couple flowers where I was testing whether it worked better to do the light first and then the dark, or the dark first and then the light, I found that it worked best to do the dark first and then the light, and I got a much better blend for the look that I was going for. For this one, I kept all of the florals the same color. The foil that I used on my background is espresso bean, so it's a really dark brown, but it almost has a bit of a hint of an orangey coppery color to it. So these pinks work perfect for it. They blend beautifully with that background. I chose a card base that looked very similar to the colors I used for my florals. This is just a piece of cardstock that I had in my scraps, so I don't even know what color it is or who makes it, but it worked perfectly with this particular background. You could also use a solid hot foiled piece of cardstock and create a mat for this, but I didn't think it was necessary. However, I did use a solid piece of hot foiled with that espresso bean for the inner part of my sentiment, and that sentiment was done with the anemone glimmer blooms. And because I used a limited color palette for that background, it came together really, really quickly as well. So these are the 3 different techniques I used for these backgrounds. Now, once again, you can use other techniques with these backgrounds as well. These are just ones I wanted to create some very simple, quick backgrounds with a very simple sentiment. And to be honest, I don't think you need much more than a very simple sentiment for these, because the florals create a very busy background. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you spending your time with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.